Welcome. My name is Roberta Kowald, and this is another installment of I'm Not There, Racial Presence and Racial Absence. And today we're going to be talking about, in this segment, Latinos in media. So one of the things that's very clear, and this was demonstrated in the 2012 National Hispanic Media Coalition Foundation study, found that the stereotypes that non-Hispanic people have of and believe to be true of Latinos and Latinas directly reflect images that they have seen in the media. This is where it comes from. So we end up with this kind of interesting thing that happens where the word illegal is kind of interesting usage. And illegal almost invariably means Latino. So when we're talking about illegal immigration, no one's ever talking about illegal French immigrants or illegal Germans or illegal Australians. It always equates to people, Hispanic people, and particularly Latinos from Mexico. So in this case, I think that this headline is very interesting. The headline is, and this was on Fox Nation, Immigration Bill Gives Illegal Immigrants Full Voting Rights. And then there was a hyperlink that went directly to an article in Politico. And it's fascinating because the article in Politico says nothing of the sort. What it actually says is that there was an immigration proposal that Congress was examining. And what Politico had pointed out was that if this proposal went through, that it would open up more Latinos in particular electorates. And given the fact that Latinos tend to vote pretty overwhelmingly Democrat, much like we see with the African American community, this might mean that Democrats could take over power in certain areas that had been long time controlled by conservative Republicans. So you have this interesting thing. First of all, the word illegal is in the title, and which was not what the Politico article was not talking about undocumented people. It was just talking about immigration policy. And so you have this extraordinary thing where immigration bill gives illegal immigrants full voting rights. Well, most of us looking at that would go, well, that sounds terrible. Why should people who don't belong who aren't citizens of a country be allowed to vote? When clearly that was not even what the study was saying. So let's talk about the use of the word illegal as opposed to the use of the word undocumented. So the NHMC study found that using the word illegal actually directly impacted people's perceptions of immigrants in a very real way. So when they would use a sentence with the word illegal, 58% of people reacted negatively to that. 49% reacted negatively when they saw the word undocumented. Same thing. And I will point out that the idea of the illegal immigrant is kind of interesting. It is not actually a crime to be in a country without the proper paperwork. It's an immigration violation. That's not a criminal action. The federal government has very few crimes that are actually controlled by the federal government. And so that's why when you get picked up for an immigration violation, they don't put you in jail. They put you in a detention center till they can figure out what to do with you. And then they just send you back to wherever you came from. But there's no criminal action or criminal sentence that goes along with that because it's simply not a crime. So the use of the word illegal is very specific because it makes us think, well, this is a crime. And a lot of my students are shocked to find out that being an undocumented immigrant is not actually a crime because it's got the word illegal. That must mean they broke the law. Well, they kind of did, but not the criminal law. So you see this constant repetition, particularly in right-wing conservative media. I mean, these are all headlines I found within a few months of each other. Two of them are a week apart. Illegals leaving feces all over El Paso, confirmed, feds ordered not to arrest illegals coming from Mexico. And again, when they're talking about this, remember, this is code for Hispanic people. This is not code for everybody, illegal French people. They're always talking about Mexicans, and specifically Mexicans. So this Time magazine cover is really interesting. It's supposed to be an article about 12 million undocumented immigrants living in the U.S. hiding. And it's supposed to be this positive article, but I find the cover really fascinating because there's no white people in this. There's no Swedes. There's no Australians. My students did find the one white guy in the picture. You can see him right under the E, but everybody else in this picture appears to be Hispanic. Maybe Southeast Asian, one or two Southeast Asians. But for the most part, it's all brown people. There's not even any African people in this. This is brown people. So you get this constant repetition that when we're talking about immigration, we're illegal or undocumented people, or illegal immigration to use their parlance. We're talking about people from Mexico. And I'll also point out the vast majority of folks who are here undocumented, as far as you can tell, and the data is a little hard to calculate, they're not actually people who snuck across the border. And that's the other important thing to remember. This is not, the vast majority of people who are undocumented in the United States at this time are not here because they snuck across the border from somewhere else. They're here on a visa that ran out. They're here because they're students whose financial aid got screwed up and they're in sort of immigration limbo. They're people who married an American and are waiting for their green cards to show up. It's that kind of stuff. So some of these people, they entered the country legally. So this idea that people illegally snuck over the border, that's not how the majority of undocumented people got here in the first place. So you end up, as a result of this constant repetition of things like this, where the NHMC asks people, how do immigrants make you feel? And I think this language is very interesting. They make me nervous. I have relatives down in Tucson. One is a law enforcement officer. You never know if they are going to get killed. And we know from the way this is worded that this person is not thinking, I'm really afraid that some illegal Swede is going to come along and shoot my relative. Again, this is code, and a fairly obvious code, for people of Latino descent. So let's talk about how people perceive characters in media. And the NHMC study also found some really interesting stuff. 74.1% of people could remember seeing a criminal or a gang member, gardeners, maids. Only 5% could remember seeing Latinos in a role as a doctor, a nurse, a lawyer, or a judge. So when faced with a character like we see here, who is a chief of police and whose entire storyline is about them being Latino, when a Latino or a Hispanic character challenged the stereotype, the non-Hispanic viewers actually remembered them as being white people. So when someone is seen as deviating from the Hispanic stereotype, white people remember them as being a white person. Oh, I didn't think they were Latino. I thought they were white. So let's talk quickly about Devious Maids. This is produced by Eva Longoria. It's been renewed for 2014. It's based on a Mexican soap opera, sort of combination of Desperate Housewives combined with this Mexican soap opera. It's been heavily criticized by a lot of people for the fact that, gee, everybody in it is Hispanic and a maid, and the word devious is in the title. And again, from Eva Longoria, who as a proud Latina should probably know better, when she was criticized for this, her response was the show represents our culture. This is despite the data that says that the vast majority of the U.S. Latino population is second, third, and fourth generation people, many of whom have college education. So this idea of all Hispanic women, all Latinas are a bunch of maids who steal stuff from rich people, and that represents the community, it's nonsensical because the data doesn't even bear that out. So this was interesting. Disney has been under fire for a long time for having very few princesses of color. So I actually got to watch this blow up on the internet, which was quite entertaining. Disney sort of proudly announced, oh, we have new Princess Sophia, our Hispanic princess. And some of us were looking at Princess Sophia and thinking, oh, that's kind of interesting because she has kind of dark blonde hair and blue eyes. Okay, that's not quite what I was thinking of when I thought of a Hispanic princess. And she's very pale skinned and very white skinned. And immediately the National Hispanic Media Group jumped on it and said, okay, why didn't you talk to us about creating a Hispanic princess? We'd have loved to work with you on this. And then immediately Disney started backpedaling, saying all of our characters come from fantasy lands, which I think is kind of interesting when you think of the African-American princess, because apparently Louisiana is a fantasy land, that may reflect elements of various cultures. For example, Sophia's mom comes from a fictitious land, Galdes, which was inspired by Spain, which is actually a real place, which apparently Disney doesn't know. So let's talk about the Tea Party Nation. So in 2010, the Tea Party Nation actually emailed 35,000 members in August, asking them to post stories highlighting, and this is the word they actually used, the victimization of Americans by illegal immigrants. And they specifically asked for stories about undocumented immigrants taking jobs, committing crimes, undermining business by providing cheap labor to competitors. So again, this constant repetition, particularly in right-wing, more conservative media, about the Hispanic as a person to be feared, and they're dangerous, and they're coming to steal our women and our jobs. And so when we talk about hijacked narratives, it gets very interesting. And when we talk about how white people tend to remember strong Hispanic characters as being white, I think a really interesting example of this is the Hunger Games in 2012. So, in fact, if you actually are a fan of the books, the novels actually have many characters of color, none of which appeared in the first films. I do understand in some of the later ones they start to pop up again. So it's interesting that the character of Katniss, and in fact the author was kind of upset about this because they had actually gone to great pains to create this character very specifically to be a strong character for brown girls to admire. So Katniss in the books is described as dark-haired and olive-skinned. The director who was casting the film for the Hunger Games only asked for Caucasian actors. So what does this mean? What does this mean when we see Hispanic actors? Why does this matter? Again, I get the same mantra, well, it's only a movie. Well, let's talk about the good, the bad, and the stereotype. What is fascinating is, again, in some of the Hispanic Media Coalition studies, they found that even one negative cue impacted perceptions, and it didn't matter where it came from. They gave people a number of statements about the Hispanic community and said, well, what do you think about? One of the statements was, do you agree or disagree with the statement Latinos are less educated? And people said, no, they're not. Latinos are fine. And then they showed them a clip from the movie Training Day, in which you have Hispanic gang members. After watching that clip, participants actually altered their view to that statement. It actually impacted the way they started thinking about Latinos. Elisa Valdez's story is very interesting. She wrote a series of books called Dirty Girls Social Club about 6 very successful, sort of a Sex in the City for Latinas, about these women who meet at Boston University. And Lifetime Television approached her and said, hey, we would love to make a series out of this. And she's in discussion with them, and they immediately started telling her, well, we need to change a few things. And she said, first of all, these women talk about things that are too smart. So, and this is an actual quote from, and I've given you the hyperlink to the article, but the actual quote from one of the executives was, why don't we make the girls debating whether or not to date men in prison? I know that's what Latinas talk about, just like it's what Black women talk about. So again, when we see these repetitions constantly over and over and over about the Latino community doesn't belong here, they're not from around here, they're all a bunch of crooks and criminals, this constant repetition. So when we talk about immigration on talk radio, in 2012, the UCLA Chicano Research Center did a paper on hate speech and found that immigration was by far the largest topic on talk radio. 91% of the guests that were brought on to shows to talk about immigration were white people. They didn't bring Hispanic people on, or Swedes, or Australians, or French people. They didn't bring anybody on except white people to talk about how to solve the Hispanic problem. And then again, not surprisingly, Latino youth, we're seeing incredible impacts of really heartbreaking levels among Latino youth. Latino youth often feel that they are perceived by authorities, first of all, interestingly enough, to be this sort of uniform group. So it doesn't matter whether you came from Mexico or Brazil or Peru or Guatemala, all brown people are exactly the same. Despite the fact that these are very different cultures and the experience of a kid coming from Brazil is going to be very different from a kid who comes from rural Mexico, that everybody's uniform and all of the attributes of this group are negative. It's a really poignant comment from a particular youth interviewed in by the National Council of the Raza on Latino youth and the school work in the juvenile justice system. One of the kids said, they think he's Mexican, he's bad, he's in a gang. The teachers, they'll sometimes look at you like they know you. They'll say you look like, or you're illegal, or you're a gang member.